I've spent most of my life reading balance sheets and annual reports, not campaign slogans. But what happened in Washington and Riyadh in the last weeks of 2025 isn't a talking point. It's a bill that will land on your kitchen table.
At the end of October, the Trump administration pushed through a new round of tariffs on imports from Saudi Arabia and several other energy partners. The effective rate on some categories is now in the 20–30% range.
A few days later, Saudi officials stood next to Chinese and Russian counterparts and quietly announced something that looked technical, but is anything but a pilot program to settle selected oil cargoes in a BRICS energy token instead of US dollars. If you don't trade bonds or oil, that might sound distant. So let's bring it closer. Mark is 58. He runs a small auto repair shop in Arizona with 6 bays, 8 employees, and a sign his father hung in 1983. His world is simple on paper: parts, payroll, rent, taxes. In 2020, his monthly parts bill averaged $4,800. By late 2025, that bill is touching $6,100, even though he hasn't expanded the shop. The brake components and specialty fluids he uses trace back through a chain of suppliers to petrochemical plants in the Gulf that are now caught in a tariff fight. Mark raised his labor rate twice this year. Customers complained. A few started putting repairs on credit cards rather than paying at the counter. When his bank renewed his credit line in November, they added a full percentage point to the interest rate because of market conditions. He didn't do anything wrong. He's simply standing at the end of a chain of decisions made thousands of miles away. That is the key point. These tariffs aren't only a message to foreign governments. They are a tax on every American who touches anything made with energy, metals, or chemicals, which is another way of saying almost everyone. When you deliberately raise the cost of doing business with your own energy partners, they don't just swallow it. They protect themselves. That is what the BRICS settlement token is about. It's not a magic coin. It's an agreement among a group of countries to say, for at least part of our energy trade, we will use something other than the U.S. dollar and the U.S. banking pipes. At launch, the volume is small. The first batch of oil sold that way in November was a single-digit percentage of monthly exports. But the direction is what matters. For 50 years, the dollar has sat at the center of energy trade. That gave the United States 2 quiet advantages. First, foreign buyers and sellers of oil needed dollars, so they held U.S. assets, especially treasuries. Second, most cross-border payments passed through systems where American regulators and courts ultimately had reach. That combination made our borrowing cheaper and our sanctions more effective. Now look at the scoreboard in December 2025. 10-year Treasury yields trade in a range that would have seemed high a few years ago. The federal government is paying tens of billions more in interest each year than it would have if markets still assumed a low, steady risk profile. Some of that is about deficits, but some of it is about trust. When allies see tariffs used as a club, they start to imagine a future in which the dollar and the legal system around it might be used against them on a bad day. If you're Linda, a 70-year-old widow in Wisconsin living on about $36,000 of Social Security and withdrawals from a modest IRA, that trust premium is not an abstract concept. In 2021, her monthly grocery bill was around $420. In the last quarter of 2025, it's closer to $520. Her electricity bill is up. Her prescription co-pays are up. Her children talk about mortgage rates the way previous generations talked about medical emergencies. She is not watching charts. She is watching the gap between what comes in and what goes out. That gap is widening, partly because the world has started to adjust to a White House that treats its own currency and alliances as bargaining chips. The tariffs may win a headline. The retaliation wins something more lasting, a reason for other countries to design a parallel track. That's what this energy token really represents, insurance for them, a warning for us. For years, people have asked me whether the dollar could lose its status overnight. My answer has been the same, probably not. Systems like this do not blow up in a single year. They drift. They decay through a series of reasonable responses to unreasonable behavior. One contract at a time, one policy at a time, the center gets a little less central. So when you hear about Saudi Arabia experimenting with non-dollar oil sales right after a new round of Trump tariffs, don't treat it as gossip from the financial pages. It is the latest entry in a ledger that tracks how much confidence the world still has in American stewardship. This is not rumor, it is a systemic signal. When that kind of signal appears, it rarely marks a single problem. It usually means several fault lines are moving at once. Trump's late 2025 tariff push and the response from energy exporters are only the visible tip. Beneath them, there is a deeper shift in how prices, rules, and expectations line up or fail to line up in the American system. Start with tariff-induced inflation. When you slap an extra 20–30% cost on inputs coming from the Gulf, you are not just taxing foreign producers. You are lifting the floor on a whole tower of prices at home. Petrochemical feedstocks go up. Plastics and industrial chemicals follow. The companies that rely on them adjust their own pricing or shrink their margins. Some of the immediate impact is hidden in contracts and hedges, but as those roll off, more of the increase leaks into final prices for cars, appliances, building materials, even certain foods. Monetary policy can lean against broad demand, but it can't surgically undo tariffs. So a distortion created for political reasons becomes a semi-permanent layer of extra cost in the economy. Household pressure and real income erosion follow. Wage growth looks decent in nominal terms. But when you benchmark what families actually pay to keep the lights on, fill the fridge, make a car payment, cover a rent or mortgage that priced in higher interest rates, the picture shifts. A family earning $8,000 may find that their safety margin is thinner than it was at $7,000 a few years ago. Once you adjust for these policy-driven price rises, that squeeze doesn't always show up neatly in the national numbers. It shows up in rising balances on high-interest credit cards and postponed medical visits, and parents telling their kids that college choices must be cheaper. Layered on top of this is the recurring threat of shutdown and federal paralysis. In 2025, Washington once again flirted with turning off the lights over routine budget disagreements. Agencies prepared contingency plans. Federal workers waited to see if their paychecks would clear. Contractors slowed hiring. This isn't just inside baseball. When the basic functioning of the government is treated as a bargaining chip, it sends a message to everyone watching that the system is willing to play close to the edge. That erodes institutional credibility. It teaches citizens and investors that what should be boring can no longer be assumed to be stable. Businesses operate inside what I would call regulatory fog. Executives look out over the next 5 to 10 years and see not a clear rule book, but a shifting outline. Tariffs used as a first resort create uncertainty about future trade relationships. Public threats against central bankers raise questions about the durability of the monetary framework. Floating trial balloons about pulling out of agreements or ignoring adverse court rulings unsettle the legal environment. Companies can adapt to tough rules and to loose rules. What they struggle with is a rule set that can be bent quickly to fit the political needs of a single figure or faction. That fog leads management teams to delay big commitments and to favor reversible moves over bold ones. Capital behavior reacts to that environment. When the signals from Washington are erratic, cash looks more attractive. Corporations hold more on their balance sheets instead of locking it up in long-lived projects. Investors demand higher returns for tying up money in sectors sensitive to policy, like heavy industry or cross-border infrastructure. The result is a cautious tilt that may not show up in stock indices, which are heavily weighted toward a few large technology firms, but that shows up in the composition of investment. More goes into short-cycle projects and buybacks less into risky productivity-enhancing ventures. Over time, that choice affects the speed at which the real economy can grow. Inside the Republican Party, internal fractures deepen the uncertainty. There are still members who care about balanced budgets, predictable rules, and alliances. There are others whose focus is permanent confrontation and unilateral power. Markets can price either philosophy if it is dominant and coherent. What they struggle with is a movement in which these currents collide unpredictably in primary contests, committee hearings, and last-minute deals. When a party that controls major levers of power oscillates between respect for norms and hostility to them, the structural pressure on the system increases. At the indicator level, you see diverging signals. Large indices may post new highs thanks to a handful of mega-cap winners and the mechanical effect of buybacks. Meanwhile, surveys of small businesses show reduced optimism. Bankers report a rise in delinquencies among smaller firms. Freight data hint at a slowdown in goods movement, even as services remain robust. This misalignment makes it easier for politicians to cherry-pick whichever data point suits their argument and harder for the public to grasp the true state of the economy. It also complicates the job of central banks and regulators who must steer using instruments calibrated for aggregate trends, not fractured ones. No group feels the strain quite like small and medium-sized enterprises. These firms are big enough to be caught in every net tariffs, regulation, credit conditions, but rarely large enough to shape the rules or lobby for exemptions. When input costs rise because of trade policy, they cannot simply shift production abroad. When borrowing costs go up because lenders factor in higher political risk, they don't have access to bond markets to refinance cheaply. They trim staff, cut training, delay succession plans. Over years, this pattern leads to consolidation as weaker players sell to stronger ones, not because the market is rewarding efficiency, but because policy has made survival more expensive. In the background, supply chains reroute. Producers and traders seek ways to reduce their exposure to the U.S. tariff and sanctions web. Some move critical parts of their value chain to jurisdictions less likely to be pulled into future disputes. Others design contracts that can flip between dollar and non-dollar settlement mechanisms. For energy exporters like Saudi Arabia, the BRICS energy token pilot is precisely that, a way to create an option. If relations with Washington worsen, they can lean more heavily on the alternative lane. If relations improve, it remains a marginal tool. For the United States, every such option that becomes operational represents a small chip taken out of the dollar's centrality. These shifts feed into a broader market caution and a political economic feedback loop. As foreign central banks and sovereign funds diversify slightly away from dollar assets, yields creep up. As yields creep up, the U.S. fiscal position looks more strained, which feeds partisan fights about spending and taxes. Those fights then produce more brinkmanship over shutdowns, over the debt ceiling, over appointments that further undermines confidence. Each cycle leaves a faint but visible mark, a little more volatility around key votes, a little less automatic deference to American leadership in international settings. The core problem is a confidence fracture. For decades, investors and partners saw Washington as noisy but at bottom reliable. In recent years, and especially under Trump's approach to tariffs, alliances, and institutions, that assumption has weakened. People no longer assume that a treaty will be honored just because it was signed, or that a norm will hold just because it's long-standing. They watch as judges are attacked, as independent agencies are threatened, as rivals are treated one day as partners, the next as enemies. In that kind of environment, it is rational, not disloyal, for foreign governments and private actors to build partial workarounds. That is the context in which a Saudi move toward a BRICS energy token in Q4 2025 has to be read. It is not simply a rebuke over one tariff round. It is a practical response to a pattern. If the United States is willing to weaponize access to its market and its currency network as a matter of routine politics, then others will invest in reducing that vulnerability. For them, it is risk management. For the U.S., it is a sign that the system built after 1945 and extended after 1990 is experiencing erosion from the edges inward. The late 2025 developments do not mean the dollar suddenly ceases to be the world's main reserve currency. They do mean that the cost of maintaining that role is rising because trust has been partially spent, not fully replaced. That cost won't be paid in press releases. It will be paid in higher interest bills, slower investment, and a quieter but real shift in the center of gravity of global finance. Once structural shifts like this begin, the question is not what they do in one quarter, but how they compound over 10 or 20 years. Short-term noise can be traded. Long-term decay is something else. It changes the baseline against which decisions are made. Looking ahead, there are three broad zones where the effects of Trump's choices will be felt if the current course continues: the health of institutions, the position of the United States in the global financial system, and the daily reality of American households. On institutions, the danger is not that one court decision or one election breaks the system outright. The danger is cumulative. When presidents publicly pressure judges, question the legitimacy of inconvenient rulings, and float the idea of ignoring constraints on their authority, they train citizens to see the law as an extension of personality rather than principle. When tariffs and sanctions are announced and revoked without consistent criteria, they send the same message about economic rules. Over a decade, that kind of behavior moves the country from a system where people plan on the basis of laws to one where they plan on the basis of who is currently in favor. That shift is a form of institutional decay. It doesn't always look dramatic. An agency loses a few experienced staffers who don't want to be part of the fight. A respected public servant decides not to accept a post. A qualified central bank nominee withdraws after being attacked for being insufficiently loyal. Each step seems small. Together, they leave the system with fewer people who are willing and able to enforce rules neutrally. Investors notice. So do allies and rivals. In the global financial system, the long-term story is about market trust degradation. For as long as I can remember, major institutions around the world treated U.S. treasuries and the dollar as the closest thing we had to a risk-free anchor. They tolerated our political theater because they believed that when it mattered, the United States would behave in a responsible way. If that belief weakens even slightly, demand for our assets becomes more conditional. Mechanisms like the BRICS energy token are a symptom of that change. They would not gain traction in a world where everyone was fully confident that American leadership would stay within certain lines. Their very existence suggests that other capitals are building hedges against a future in which Washington's use of its financial power is more self-interested and less predictable. Over 20 years, those hedges can grow from pilots into pillars. That won't eliminate the dollar's role, but it can dilute it enough to raise our cost of capital and reduce our leverage when we most want it. For American households, the long-term consequences will not show up as a single breaking point. They will show up as a series of disappointments. Pension funds that have to lower their expected return assumptions because safe assets yield less in real terms once extra risk premia are priced in. Governments at every level that face higher borrowing costs and must choose between cutting services, raising taxes, or tolerating more debt. Wage earners who find that even when the headline economy looks fine, their own path to owning a home, saving for retirement, or starting a business is steeper. Those outcomes are not inevitable. They are the result of choices. You cannot have everything at once. Aggressive use of tariffs and financial coercion for political gain, disregard for constraints that gave you credibility, and a world that continues to treat your currency and institutions as the obvious default. Arithmetic does not negotiate. If you increase perceived risk, the price of that risk goes somewhere. In this case, it goes into the rates at which you borrow and the terms on which others are willing to rely on you. There are lessons here that go beyond one president or one party. Trust is not an abstraction. It is built slowly through boring consistency and lost quickly through conspicuous departures. Discipline in policy, fiscal, monetary, and legal is not a luxury for calm times. It is the main defense against storms. Clarity matters because markets and citizens can absorb bad news if they believe the numbers and the rules. And humility matters because no country, however powerful, can indefinitely bend the world to fit its domestic political needs without facing pushback. When you ignore these lessons, you set off processes that are hard to reverse. Foreign partners do not announce, "We no longer trust you." They simply sign contracts in other currencies, build facilities in other jurisdictions, and staff their ministries with people whose first reflex is to hedge against you rather than coordinate with you. Domestic actors do not declare, "We have lost faith in our institutions." They just become more cynical, more transactional, and more willing to entertain extreme proposals. The speed of visible change can be misleading. For a while, stock indices may rise, unemployment may stay low, and consumers may keep spending. It is easy in those moments to dismiss warnings as pessimism. But the underlying structure is what determines how a system reacts when pressure increases. If you have spent years undermining independent institutions, scattering regulatory signals, and treating allies as expendable, you will discover at some point that fewer people believe your promises and more people demand collateral. Markets smell uncertainty. They may not read every page of every policy document, but they are very good at detecting patterns of behavior. When they sense that a country's leaders are willing to gamble with foundational commitments for short-term advantage, they adjust. They lend a little less freely. They price a little more risk. They listen a little more closely to alternatives. At the individual level, some of these debates can feel distant, but the outcomes are not. You cannot spin a grocery bill. If tariffs and financial fragmentation raise the cost of energy and food, families will feel it every week. If higher interest costs crowd out investment in infrastructure and education, communities will feel it in slower growth and fewer opportunities. If political drama around the debt ceiling or government funding regularly threatens basic services, citizens will feel it in their sense of security. The path forward requires a change in attitude as much as in policy. It means recognizing that the real strength of the United States has never been in a single leader's toughness, but in the reliability of its courts, its contracts, its currency, and its commitments. It means understanding that the dollar's role is not guaranteed by nostalgia, but by current behavior. It means accepting that treating partners with respect and rules with seriousness is not weakness. It is the condition for long-term influence. Institutions matter. They are the scaffolding that holds up everything else: markets, alliances, household plans. If you weaken them for temporary applause, you may enjoy the noise, but you will not like the silence that follows when trust is thinned and the bills come due.
The decisions being made around tariffs, currency, and power today are not just moves in a political game. They are entries in a long ledger that future investors, workers, and families will inherit.